Okay, so here we are, chapter 20, part 1. I've already gone over part of this in class before we left for the break. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this first section. It may have been a couple of weeks by the time you watch this video, so I will review over it rather quickly, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. So here we are, chapter 20, part 1. We're looking at World War II. We're not actually going to get into the actual war itself during this chapter. We're more looking at the build up to World War II. So the broad themes of the chapter, we're going to talk about the effect of World War I on global culture. We'll talk about the politics after World War I, and then the rise of totalitarianism. So this first section, and again, if you will look back in your notes that you took before the break, is all about life and culture in the Western world after World War I. And it's entitled here, Uncertainty in Modern Thought. I think I mentioned in class, I also like the phrase Age of Anxiety, because people in the West, for a very long time, again, they thought that they were the pinnacle of human achievement. They were the most technologically advanced culture on the history of the planet. They thought they were the most developed culture in the history of the planet. And so they really thought that they were moving in the right direction. And then all of a sudden, boom, World War I happens and everyone begins to question their values and beliefs. You know, if our culture was so great, how did we end up in the situation that we're in? Remember, before World War I, a lot of people believed in the idea of progress, that every day we're doing a little bit better. And it was easy to understand how that might be the case when you look back at Western culture, right? Because certainly technologically speaking, you can see that we were progressing very rapidly at this point from, kind of the low point in the Middle Ages to the Industrial Revolution. You can definitely see that we are advancing. Well, not everyone bought into this idea. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a famous German philosopher, died a little bit before the time we're looking at. He lived from 1844 to 1900. But one of his most famous quotes is that God is dead. And he wasn't necessarily talking about God, the Christian God, God big G. He was really making this statement more about the West in general. That God no longer ruled Western thought and life, that God was no longer a source of morality for the West, and basically that the West was in decline. This was a rejection of absolute values. We spoke about the idea of nihilism. Other ideas in modern philosophy, we spoke about logical imperialism, this idea that the only thing that really matters is something that can be proven. So things like, ideas of freedom and truth and justice and morality, those things can't ever be proven one way or the other, and so they don't even really matter. So why are we talking about them? The other kind of new thinking in modern philosophy was the idea of existentialism, this search for literally the why do we exist? This search for meaning. Remember, we spoke about Jean-Paul Sartre, who said that man is condemned to be free, that man has to define himself because there is no overarching meaning to it all. We spoke about discoveries in science, specifically with Marie Curie and Max Planck. Uh, Marie Curie, of course, discovers radiation. Planck came up with quantum theory, this idea that light and matter might be different forms of basically the same thing. Albert Einstein and his theory of general relativity. Remember, science was the bedrock of Western foundation. We were talking about this idea of progress and how you could look at, Europe in the Middle Ages, Europe during the Scientific Revolution, Europe during the Industrial Revolution, and you could see how society was marching forward. And a big part of that was science. A big part of that was technology, and it really was the foundation that a lot of Western culture was built on. And now all of a sudden, people feel like they have had the rug pulled out from under them, right? the constants that they knew about the world around themselves, turns out we didn't know all that much. And so, it's great that we are continually learning new things, but, the idea that we don't know as much as we thought we did, that is very unsettling to a lot of people. Psychology is going to take several steps forward. We spoke about Sigmund Freud, who said that you yourself are not a unified, rational, cohesive individual. You're made up of all these different parts that are continuously fighting one another. You've got the id, which is sort of the lizard brain, the primitive, irrational mind, your primal urges. I need to eat, I need to sleep. That's what drives you forward. And then you've got the ego, which is the rational consciousness, which recognizes that you live in polite society, and so there are some things you should do and some things you shouldn't do. And then, of course, that's tempered by the superego, which is your sense of morality. Okay. We spoke about different artistic movements, post-impressionists, such as you see here on the left, Cezanne, and then Van Gogh on the right. Again, they're not concerned with super photorealism like we might have saw during the Renaissance. Much more emotive, much more focused on how you're feeling. This is Guernica by Pablo Picasso, a cubist. And again, this comes a little bit later after the Spanish Civil War, which we'll actually talk about here in just a few minutes. But again, it has gone from just being emotive to super abstract. And then we get even further afield, right? Surrealists become very popular. This is a piece by Rene Magritte. This is not a pipe. And then, of course, The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali. We see changes in architecture. This is one of the, if not the first skyscraper, the Wainwright building in St. Louis. And then also we see the Falling Waters house. What you see is designed to blend into its surroundings. It's very, very modern, lots of flat levels, just something that is remarkably different than anything that had come before. Okay, so that was just a quick review over what we had already covered in class. This is all new material. Search for political stability. Remember, the peace treaty that ended World War I was known as the Treaty of Versailles. And even at the time, the world leaders who sat down around the big table and signed this peace treaty knew that it was a band-aid solution. They knew that it wasn't perfect. Looking back on it through the lens of history, we know absolutely that the Treaty of Versailles didn't solve any problems, and in fact, it created new ones. In particular, Germany hates the Treaty of Versailles. And of course, we've spoken about why Germany bore most of the blame for World War I. Most countries held them accountable. They lost the most land. They had to get rid of their army. They had to pay these reparation payments. So Germany in particular hates the Treaty of Versailles. But even the Allies are still conflicted about how they feel. France, for example, is incredibly angry still, and with good reason. World War I, most of the major battles were fought on French soil. And so there in France, in some ways, were the ones who suffered the most. And so they're still angry at Germany. They want their money. They want their pound of flesh, and they really feel betrayed almost by the United States and by England. England was kind of over it at this point. England wanted a strong Germany. They knew that a strong Germany would be a good trading partner for them, that they could sell lots of stuff to Germany and they could buy lots of German stuff. And so England is more on board with having a strong Germany. France absolutely did not. Now, the German government that was in charge during World War I, remember we said that the unification of Germany resulted in a German empire. Well, the German empire is gone. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Bill as he was known in the United States, he is no longer in charge. The German empire is dissolved. and it's been replaced by an entirely new government known as the Weimar Republic. So the German Empire is gone, and a new democratically elected Republican type government has taken its place. Um, and as you might expect, it comes into pretty shaky circumstances, right? Uh, it has inherited a lot of the problems after World War One, and is not going to be able to solve a lot of them. So it comes into existence, and first thing off the bat is it has to worry about making these payments. In 1921 dollars, Germany owed $33 billion. That's a lot of money. If they had stuck to the schedule, I don't have the exact year, but if they had stuck to the payment schedule, they would have been making payments until the 1980s. That was just decades and decades of money down the drain that Germany did not want to pay. And in fact, they made the first payment and then they were unable. It wasn't necessarily even that they didn't want to, they just didn't have the money, even if they wanted to. They were unable to make any payments after that first one. Well, France is angry about this, and again, they want their money, they want to get paid. And so they threatened to take over. They threatened to march in troops to Germany, take control of the country, and one way or another, they were going to get paid. So here we are, basically 5 years after the end of World War One, and people are already at each other's throats again. It looks like France is going to invade Germany. It looks like we're going right back to war. Well, by 1923, both sides kind of step down. Both sides kind of come to their senses, really, and the situation diffuses for a number of reasons. Probably the biggest of which was a plan from the United States known as the Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan was a financial plan. It was named after this guy, Charles Dawes, best described as circular loans. And looking back on it through the lens of history, it doesn't make much sense. But at the time, it stopped a war. So the way that it worked was the United States had lots of money, or they thought they had lots of money. And so what they were going to do, they were going to loan money to Germany. Germany could use that money to pay off their payments to Great Britain and France, who, as it turns out, the United States loaned a lot of money to Britain and France during the war. And so they owed the United States a lot of money. So the United States gave money to Germany, which used it to pay off their debt to Great Britain and France, who could use that money to pay off their debt to the United States. And so the money is just moving around in a giant circle. That's why they're known as circular loans. Money from the U.S. to Germany, Germany to Great Britain and France, Great Britain and France back to the United States. Nothing was really happening. Nothing was really changing. Nothing was really getting solved. It was just moving money around on paper. At the time, this was a big deal. And in fact, I think Dawes won a Nobel Peace Prize for this because it did. It did prevent a war. However, it didn't solve any of the long-term issues. But Germany gets a chance to flourish. They do get back on their feet. They join the League of Nations. They sign the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was an agreement started by the United States, basically asking countries to promise not to fight wars anymore. I forget how many countries signed it. Virtually every country on the planet signed this thing, and they all said, we promise not to wage aggressive war. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was an agreement not to fight wars anymore. And of course, that goes out the window because we're about to fight World War II. But there was a lot of optimism as we moved from the mid-1920s towards the late 1920s. We do see a kind of surge in worldwide optimism. That is until 1929. The good times could not last. In October of 1929, the American stock market crashed. And while that may not necessarily have been a cause of the Great Depression, it was more of a signal of the Great Depression. People quickly realized we were in for a very rough ride. The Great Depression begins in the United States for a number of reasons. Part of it was maldistribution of wealth. The rich were incredibly rich and the poor were incredibly poor. And so, if you looked at the average, if you looked at the economic activity in the United States, it painted a pretty rosy picture. Um, Things were happening, things were booming. The Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, things were all pointed in the right direction if you looked at it on paper. But if you looked at the actual people, like I say, the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and that is a recipe for disaster. Um, the problem is that the rich could only buy so many washing machines. The rich could only buy so many radios. The rich could only buy so many wristwatches. And so once we kind of hit that saturation point, the rich didn't want to buy anymore, the poor couldn't buy anymore, and that's when the bottom fell out of the economy. America had loaned a lot of money to foreign countries, and when the crisis hit the United States, it began to call in those loans. And so the Great Depression starts in the United States, but it's going to spread throughout the world. So, maldistribution of wealth, buying too many things on credit, the stock market crash, all of these things are signals of the coming Great Depression. Just a word about this picture. This is a picture by Dorothea Lange called Migrant Mother. Dorothea Lange was a photographer that was paid by the United States to travel throughout America chronicling the Great Depression. And this was a young mother, I believe, on their way out of Oklahoma. She came upon this family. Their car had broken down by the side of the road. The men had gone into the nearest town to try to find parts to fix their car. And they left the mother and her children behind. And you can just see the desperation, the uncertainty on her face. She doesn't know what's coming next. Like I say, it starts in the United States, but it spreads all over the globe. Massive worldwide unemployment leads to massive social problems. The United States, 1 out of 4 people was out of work, 25% unemployment. The stock market crashed, erased billions of dollars worth of money. This leads to things like increasing suicide rates. Uh, People are getting married later, they're starting families later, birth rates go into massive decline, divorce rates begin to shoot up. Like I say, massive social problems caused by the Great Depression. It starts in the United States. We're actually the second hardest hit. There's actually a country that gets it even worse than the United States. I do want to point out um, the American president at this time. When the Great Depression started, the American president was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a Republican who very much believed in the idea that the government should stay out of business. Remember, he believed in this idea of a self-regulating market, and that the less that government had to do with economics, the better off everyone would be. The less rules, the less regulation, the less interference that government had with the economy, the better off everyone would be. The problem with this thinking is when the Great Depression began, Hoover just thought it was a natural part of the cycle. You have ups, but you also have downs. And so he was very reluctant to get the government involved. From 1921 to like 1928, the economy had grown uninterrupted. It was every day was better than the day before. It just grew and grew and grew and grew. That's why it was known as the Roaring Twenties. And he said, okay, well, we've had 8 years of growth. We've had 8 really good years, and now it's, time for some bad years. The problem is that we never came up out of it. It wasn't just a normal business cycle. We didn't go down a little bit and then come up a little bit like you might have seen in a normal cycle. It just went further and further and further down. It was cratering. So he was president when it got started. He was voted out of office in 1932, and Franklin Roosevelt became president. This isn't an American history class, so we're not going to go super in depth on it. But of course, FDR began what he called the New Deal, and FDR was much more open to getting the government involved than Herbert Hoover was. He started a number of programs designed to put money back into the economy, designed to put people back to work. England did all right during the Great Depression, mostly because they realized very early on what was happening, and they decided to only take care of themselves. We'll talk about economic nationalism here in just a second, but England did all right. France, it hit France later, so they were spared some of the opening stuff. So it was delayed in hitting France, but so it hit them later, but it also hit them harder. When it finally did get to France, it hit them pretty hard. And then Spain, it got so bad in Spain that they had a civil war. And we'll talk about this, I think, in the next part of chapter 20. The Spanish Civil War, in many ways, was kind of a preview of World War II. There was one side that was backed up by the British and the French, and then there was another side that was backed up by the Italians and the Germans. And the side that was backed by Germany won. And so that really should have opened a lot of people's eyes as to what was going on. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, like I said, by the mid 1930s, many European governments are abandoning this idea of free markets, and they're focusing more on economic nationalism. Remember, nationalism is kind of an inherently us versus them mentality. And when times get tough, people stop caring about anyone else and they only focus on what matters to them. Economic nationalism. This massive worldwide depression is also going to lead to the rise of new dictators. Rise of authoritarian states in Europe during the 1930s. And there's two types of European dictators, conservative and radical. And we've already spoken about conservatism as a political force. And this was nothing new. Conservative leaders have been around since World War I. I mean, you can look back at some of the absolutist kings of France, maybe the early English kings, and I think you can make the argument they were conservative. Maybe dictators is not the right word, but they were certainly conservative leaders with a lot of power. Conservatism is nothing new. That's what I'm getting at. Conservatism in power, that was nothing new. That's been around for years and years and years and years. We're going to see something different happen in the 1930s. It happens in the Soviet Union, it happens in Germany, it happens in Italy, and it's known as radical totalitarianism. And this is a different type of leadership. This is a different type of dictatorship that we see in Europe. And you can see there it's the root of totalitarianism is total, and that's what it was all about. Totalitarianism is this idea that the state has total control over society. It's not just about keeping political power. It's not just about having power over the government, but it's also about controlling politics. It's about controlling economics. It's about controlling society, the intellectuals of your country, culture, arts, everything. You want total control over all aspects of society. And again, this is in direct opposition to liberalism. Remember, the idea behind liberalism is to limit the power of the state and to protect the rights of the individual. That is absolutely not the goal of radical totalitarian dictators. They want to control everything. And very often they did this by mobilizing society towards overcoming a goal. And we kind of spoke about this during the unification of Italy and Germany, right? How do you want to unify people? How do you get everyone on the same page? You give them a goal. You give them someone to fight against. You give them a common enemy. All right, let's talk about the Soviet Union for just a moment. Last time we left the Soviet Union, Lenin was in charge. The Russian Civil War was over. The Bolsheviks won. And so now we have a new socialist state. Um, Russia was in pretty bad shape. Um, Russia was going downhill even during the last days of the Russian Empire. As we moved through the early 1900s, Russia was in a bad situation already, which is why the revolution happened, right? That's the entire reason that we saw the Bolshevik Revolution, is because Russia was already hurting. Well, so when Lenin comes into power, he knows that he has to do something to try to solve the problems. And he begins what's known as the New Economic Policy. And the thing that's interesting about the NEP is that it wasn't super strict. It did provide for limited economic freedom. Heavy industry remained nationalized, that the government controlled it. But with like mom and pop type stores, they were allowed to exist, and it was very successful, and people really liked it. However, Lenin died in 1924. And before he died, he did not leave behind a chosen successor. He left no plans. He didn't say, after I die, this guy's next. And so it sets off kind of a war of succession. Everybody wants to be leader, and they're all going to fight it out amongst themselves to figure out who that's going to be. So the first contender we have is Leon Trotsky, and we've already spoken about Trotsky. Trotsky was the hero of the Bolshevik Revolution. He was the one who seized control of the military and placed Lenin in power. He was kind of Lenin's right-hand man. And so, yeah, he seems like a natural candidate to continue on after Lenin died. But he's going to face opposition from the man pictured here, Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was the general secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And of course, the Communist Party was the only party. And so Joseph Stalin had a lot of power. And in fact, in the end, Stalin will win control of the Soviet Union. By 1927, he is the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union. In fact, Trotsky had to flee. He fled to South America, and eventually he will be assassinated by Joseph Stalin. So anyway, so by 1927, Stalin had secured all power in the Soviet Union, and now he's ready to put his plans into motion. He did not agree with Lenin's policies. He did not agree with this new economic policy. And so he begins a series of plans to seize power in the Soviet Union. He called them his 5-year plans. And these were plans to grow Soviet power. And literally, he would say, here we are today. This is where we're going to be in 5 years. Let's make this happen. It was a 5-year plan to advance the Soviet Union. And so the first area was going to be in agriculture. Stalin figured he had to bring the peasants in line. And remember, the peasants, the farmers, these were the people who were unhappy with the the first Russian Revolution, right? They wanted this new government that after the Tsar was out, they wanted this new government to come in and give them land, and they never got it, and that's one of the things that led to the Bolshevik Revolution. Um, and so he decides to collectivize, is the word that he used. Collectivization. He basically went into all these little individual farms, and he lumped them all together into these giant state-run farms. And instead of being a farmer who owned your own farm, you are now an employee of the state that worked on one of these state-run farms. And this was a disaster. These peasants didn't want jobs. They wanted to own the land. Um, and so just on so many levels, it did not work. The peasants were not motivated because if you worked harder, if you grew more crops, you if you harvested more crops, you didn't get a bigger paycheck because you were just an employee. So people didn't work hard. People who were really angry actually tried to sabotage this, that they didn't take care of the equipment. And agricultural output in Russia took a steep nosedive, and millions of people starved to death because they couldn't feed themselves. So the collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union was an unparalleled disaster. Now, industry was better, especially heavy industry, these factory jobs. Was much more successful, and the Soviet Union saw very rapid growth. Uh, Life was not easy. But when people saw what was happening in the West, they didn't feel quite so bad. There was never enough to eat. People felt like they never really made enough money. Living space was extremely limited. Goods were in constant shortage. But when you looked at what was happening in, say, the United States, um, the Russians thought that they had it pretty good. The Great Depression never came to Russia. They were completely insulated from the Great Depression. And so you can just imagine a lot of the Russian leaders are sitting back and telling the United States, I told you so. We told you that capitalism was wrong. We told you that eventually your system was going to crumble, and now it's happening, and you're witnessing it firsthand. And so the Soviet Union, yeah, times were tough, but compared to what was going on in, say, the United States or in France, the Soviets thought that they had won. And there were some benefits in the Soviet Union. Uh, Medical treatment was completely free in the Soviet Union. Education was completely free in the Soviet Union. There was virtually no unemployment during the Great Depression. The Soviet government provided for old age pensions way before the United States did. Freedoms for women. Women could get educated. Women could get good jobs in the Soviet Union. So, the Soviet Union during the Great Depression, while the capitalist economies are crumbling into dust, the Soviet Union is kind of sitting back laughing, saying, we told you so. Now, as time goes on, as we move through the 1930s, Stalin becomes more and more paranoid. Um, he's attempting to consolidate power. He's attempting to control more and more. And so, even top members of the Communist Party, even people that he once regarded as allies, he believed were working against him. And so, he began a series of political purges designed to get rid of his enemies. Uh, Hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people. I don't know how many people that just disappeared into the night, that were sent to these political prisons known as gulags. Um, but it worked for Stalin, and he was able to remain in control. Now let's talk about Italy for a second. Italy in the early 1900s was really in a period of transition. Um, as we move into the early 1900s, the Italian government was pretty liberal, but they had a lot of problems that they were trying to deal with. Italy had some areas of extreme poverty. This Italian unification, Italy as the notion of Italy as a country was still relatively new. And so there are still some people that don't even buy into the idea of Italy. They're much more concerned about local matters than about what was going on in Italy as a nation. World War I didn't help matters. Italy came to the war late, and really they only got involved in World War I to try to get land. They came in late to try to get on the winning side just so they could get some like loot out of it, and that didn't work out for them. Um, and so Italy's got some issues. So we've got a government that's fairly liberal. Italy also had a pretty large socialist population. There were a lot of Italians who saw what was going on in the Soviet Union, and they liked what they saw, and they said, listen, the Russian Soviets have the right idea, and we need to have that here. So we have a liberal government. We've got pretty active socialists that are trying to start a revolution in Italy. But we also have a large population of conservatives in Italy. Of course, remember, the Roman Catholic Church was still headquartered in Rome, and so there's still a large conservative population in Italy that are in opposition to both the liberals and the socialists. And so Italy in the early 1900s is kind of a mess. They've got all these different competing political philosophies, and into this fight between the socialists, the liberals, and the conservatives will come this guy, Benito Mussolini, who was the leader of the black shirts. And he and his black shirts are going to start a new political party in Italy known as the Fascist Party. And this is actually capital F, capital P, the Fascist Party of Italy. Fascism is a new political philosophy that comes out of the 1920s into the 1930s out of Italy. So let's talk about this new political philosophy for a moment. Political philosophy of fascism. The first thing I want you to know about fascism is that it's all about the state. It's not about you as an individual. It's not about your freedom of speech. It's not about your right to bear arms or your freedom of religion. It's all about the state and how to make the state stronger. And so the argument is under fascism, in order to have a unified state, in order to have a strong state, you must have one singular identity. So everyone must speak the same language. Everyone must practice the same religion. Everyone must eat the same food. Everyone must look the same. Everyone must dress the same. And so that there is strength in unity. And so it's not about you as an individual and what's best for you. It's about what can you do to make the state better. And if you don't belong to this singular identity, if you don't speak the language, if you don't practice the religion, if you don't eat the food, you must assimilate. And if you don't assimilate, then you're going to have lots of problems. Second thing I want you to know about fascism is that fascism is an inherently belligerent political philosophy. They're always looking to pick a fight. They're always acting aggressive because, again, the idea is how do we make the state stronger? Well, you make the state stronger by fighting other states and beating them. War is good. War makes a state stronger. And then lastly is a focus on hierarchy. You need a ruling class in order to direct the state. And so usually that's going to be your military leaders, which makes sense if you're a country that's always looking to pick fights, and if you're a country always looking to be at war, you would want your military leaders in charge. This is the political symbol of the fascist party. This is actually an ancient Roman symbol. It's known as the fasces. That's where the word fascist comes from. The fasces were a bundle of rods tied together, and you can see that's an axe. And so the idea is you can see the symbolism, right? Taken individually, any one of these sticks, you could probably break with your hands, but you tie them all together and it becomes unbreakable. And that was the idea, right? One singular identity. The state must be unified, and if the state is unified, they will be unbeatable. And so this was the political ideology that Benito Mussolini believed in, and this is eventually the ideology that's going to take over Italy. By 1924, Mussolini will be in complete control of Italy. Now, it was something of a compromised revolution. He always, for example, had to share power with the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church is a major force in Italy. They're a major force worldwide, but especially in Italy. And so this was always a bit of a compromised revolution because he was never 100% in charge in Italy. We do see a truly totalitarian state come about in Germany, of course, under Adolf Hitler. Hitler's a really interesting guy, and we could spend all semester talking about him. And of course, as the person to blame for most of World War II, a lot has been written about Hitler, and a lot of people have studied Hitler for a very long time. So I'm just going to hit the high points here. Um, Hitler was born in Austria, and he picked up a lot of his extreme views while living in Austria as a young man. Initially, he wanted to be an artist. He felt a calling to be a painter, and that's what he had envisioned when he was a young man. Of course, that's not going to work out for him. But while living in Austria, he was sort of bitten by the German nationalism bug. German nationalism was particularly strong in Austria, and this is before World War One. And so Hitler became convinced of the superiority of German, and as he saw it, the German race. And so when World War One came along, Hitler was on cloud nine. Hitler loved World War One because it gave his life meaning. He served in the German army. He was a very low rank, but he was convinced that this was finally the opportunity to show the world just how superior the German race really was. And of course, when Germany lost, uh, Hitler was crushed, and he just couldn't believe that this happened. And so he began looking for a scapegoat, right? Obviously, in Hitler's eyes, the German nation could not be to blame, so someone else had to be blamed for why Germany lost World War One. So that's what kind of sets it all off. In 1919, Hitler is going to join the German Workers' Party, which was a small extremist group in Germany. They did not like socialists. They did not like Jewish people. They did not like the Democrats in charge of the Weimar Republic. They didn't like anybody. They promised German greatness under what they called National Socialism. I do want to point this out very quickly, just as kind of an aside. Um, I think we've said previously that socialists, if you look at the political spectrum, here in the United States, we talk about the right and the left, right? People on the right are generally conservative, people on the left are liberal. Socialism is extreme left. Socialism is if you go even further to the left of American liberalism, you're going to end up in socialism. Fascism, which is what we saw in Italy and in Germany, that's further to the right. So, fascism, extreme right, liberalism, or excuse me, socialism, extreme left. I do want to point out that the socialists of, the Soviets in the Soviet Union hated the fascists, and the fascists hate them. So I just want to point that out very quickly. But okay. So in 1919, Hitler joins the German Workers' Party, a small extremist group. As I mentioned, they hate socialists, they hate Marxists, they hate Jews, they hate the Democrats. And by 1921, Hitler was in charge. And in 1923, Hitler saw his opportunity. This was kind of the low point for the Weimar Republic. They couldn't make these payments to France. France was threatening to invade. And so Hitler attempts a revolution. Hitler attempts a coup of the German government. It's known as the Beer Hall Putsch. And it's called the Beer Hall Putsch because literally Hitler and his cronies are out drinking one night in this German beer tavern, and he probably had a little too much to drink. And they're talking and they're growing more agitated. And so suddenly Hitler jumps up on the table and he says, "Tonight's the night, let's go get them." And they all run out into the night to overthrow the government. And of course, they're immediately all arrested and thrown in jail. It is a complete failure. Hitler is arrested and he's thrown in jail for trying to overthrow the government. And while he's in jail, Hitler has an epiphany. He has a revelation. And he writes a book. Of course, it's a very famous book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. And in this book, he basically lays out his plans to take over Germany. And he says, listen, I can't overthrow the government. Overthrowing the government and taking the government by force is never going to work. I have to take power legally. I have to undermine the government. I can't just physically destroy the Weimar Republic. I've got to find some way to take power from the inside. So after he gets out of prison for the next 4 or 5 years, he concentrates on growing the German Workers' Party, which is now known as the National Socialist Party, or of course, the Nazi Party. So for 5 years, from 1924 to 1929, he's in charge of the Nazi Party. He concentrates on growing it, but it's still a pretty small minority. They don't have a lot of power in Germany yet until the Great Depression. I said that the United States was the second hardest country hit. Germany is the hardest hit country in the Great Depression. And Hitler is able to use this to his advantage. And this is why Hitler becomes so popular in the first place. I want you guys to realize, I mean, it's very easy, again, looking through the lens of history, to look back on Hitler and realize Hitler was a bad guy. Why did Hitler ever, get put in charge? Why did anyone ever swear allegiance to Hitler? Hitler did not come to power by promising to kill millions of people. That's not how he got into positions of power. He got into power by promising economic salvation. Hitler was aiming his speeches at the middle class. Germany had people who were out of work. They couldn't put food on the table. They couldn't afford to buy the things they need. And so Hitler stood up and said, I'm going to save you. And here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to put everyone back to work. I'm going to make sure that everyone has the food that they need. And then kind of as an aside, he kind of worked in there. And by the way, here's who to blame for our troubles. But that wasn't necessarily the focus right off the bat. He kind of downplayed his anti-Semitism for the moment and concentrated mainly on economics. Very popular among the middle class, very popular among the German youth. Um, and he was able to fulfill these promises. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But all of a sudden, the Nazis are the largest party in the Reichstag. The Reichstag is the German legislature. And by 1933, Hitler has done exactly what he said he was going to do. By 1933, Hitler is legally named chancellor, and he is able to take control of Germany. Now, once he's in power, he is able to create sort of an unstoppable dictatorship. He creates an atmosphere of fear. He outlaws rival political parties. He outlaws other organizations that he saw as threats. And then all of a sudden, Germany is a one-party state. The Nazis are the only party that's left. They're in all the top government positions. They create a number of new organizations, a lot of paramilitary organizations, and Hitler begins his purges. He begins to remove the intellectuals that spoke out against him. He removed socialists and Democrats who spoke out against him. And of course, most famously, he begins systematic discrimination against Jewish people in Germany. And we'll talk about the Holocaust a little bit later on in the second part of chapter 20. But I want you to know that even before World War II, going all the way back to the early to mid 1930s, the Jewish people were discriminated against in Germany, culminating in what was known as the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in 1938, which was a widespread program against Jewish people. Jewish businesses were attacked and looted. Jewish people were assaulted on the street. As kind of a culmination of this very slow, systematic discrimination against Jewish people. And from 1938, we're about to kick off World War II. It's going to shift, unfortunately, into high gear. But we will pick that up with chapter 20.